All right, guys, so here's your lecture for today, since I won't be here. So pretty much what the focus of today is the U.S. involvement, direct involvement in World War One, and then the immediate aftermath and the downfall of Woodrow Wilson. So when we look at mobilization into World War One, even though we declare war in April, May of 1917 after the Zimmerman Note, we really don't get anybody over there until late in the year. And part of the reason why is because of recruitment. Part of the reason why is because of transportation. There's no air travel over to Europe at the moment, so it's recruit the soldiers, basic training, ship them over, train again because trench warfare is a lot different. And then after about 6 months, then they're ready to go. And by the time that we get our troops over there, part of the whole thing is the Europeans have been fighting for 3 years, and when we show up, we're stocky, we're well built. We have not been starving in trenches for years, so that's one of the reasons why they call us doughboys. So it's very eye-opening in terms of the situation that the Europeans are dealing with when it comes to trench warfare and how taxing it is, both physically and mentally. And when we look at the situation that we enter into, the saving grace for the Germans has been the communist revolution in Russia. So them sending V.I. Lenin, very much allows the Russians to enter into a civil war, which we'll get into during the 1920s, and then it allows the Germans to focus all of their efforts on the Western Front. So we get there, and in the spring of 1918, what we see is that the Germans unleash that first assault, and the British and the French hold, and it is this renewed enthusiasm to fight that the Americans bring, because we're healthy, we're bringing a lot of food with us, we're bringing a lot more military equipment with us. And when that initial push stalls out, what we start to see is that the German army is going to start to crack. And the Germans have had superior technology. The Germans have had superior weaponry. And you know what ends up occurring is that German morale begins to fade. Frustration with the Kaiser begins to increase. And just the addition of the Americans boosts morale for the Allied powers. And then what we get in the spring of 1918 is the release of another pandemic. So if you can remember back to those days, pretty much 5 years ago, about when COVID started, we have the Spanish flu, the influenza epidemic that starts to, ravage the front lines here. And this is something that the Germans also have to deal with. So the Germans eventually, their population is decimated, and they have a lot of people who are sick, and that's a higher percentage than on the Allied side. And eventually, the Germans are able to push the Kaiser out, and then peace negotiations are going to be able to start. So an armistice gets signed November 11th of 1918, and then we start the peace process. Woodrow Wilson is the first acting president that goes to Europe. So he is the first person as president of the United States, travels across the Atlantic and steps on European soil. We've had presidents go over there, but not while they've been president. Jefferson was an ambassador to France, but he was not president. So when we look at this, Woodrow Wilson at the beginning of this whole process He has an aura about him. He saved Western democracy. The use of the United States, finished off the Germans. So what we have during the initial peace talks is this ultimate respect for Woodrow Wilson. All right. So Wilson is joined by Vittorio Orlando of Italy, David Lloyd George of Great Britain, and Georges Clemenceau of France. And what they want to do is they want to settle these peace talks quickly, so that way they can then involve themselves in this communist revolution that's occurring in Russia. Well, the peace talks are going to drag out. All right. And, when looking back at Wilson's 14 points, the most important point is creating this League of Nations. So Woodrow Wilson is going to sacrifice, the lack of imperialism. He's gonna sacrifice, a lot of these other things to get the League of Nations. And why is that? Well, because Wilson has a lot of pride. We see government officials go places today. Whether it's the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, they go to places and they want to help negotiate treaties. But at the end of the day, they can't make declarations on behalf of the U.S. government, because the U.S. government, even though the president can help make policy, some policy requires laws. Here, a treaty can only be signed by the Senate. So Woodrow Wilson goes over by himself, and he doesn't bring any Republicans with him. So this treaty that Woodrow Wilson wants, he can't even follow through on. And this is something that the Europeans eventually realize. David Lloyd George is the prime minister. He's in charge of the majority party of parliament. Georges Clemenceau is in charge, has majority representation in the French government. They don't understand that Woodrow Wilson can't do this by himself. American politics states that actually the U.S. needs the Republicans. Wilson needs his opposition party in order to sign off on this. So when Wilson goes back and this whole 14-point treaty falls apart, the French and the British look at this and they're like, okay, now we can get what we want. And this is why we don't sign the Treaty of Versailles, is because the Republicans don't like the League of Nations. They think it violates our own particular sovereignty. And this is why you see at the bottom, the French get coaling rights in the Rhineland, Germany. This is why Japan takes over German economic holdings in China. This is why the French and the British get oil rights in the Middle East, in the former Ottoman Empire. You know, Wilson's pride and lack of involvement of the Republican Party when he needs them, at a time in which people panic over international affairs, it's why this treaty is such a disaster. So, Wilson has no leg to stand on when he is done, you know, negotiating. So he basically gives in on every other thing that he would want, to make the world safe for democracy, because he so desperately wants the League of Nations, right? And the Europeans, by the end of this, they see him as a joke because he doesn't have much power. So the British and the French particularly, they're going to create a treaty that is going to just demoralize and destroy the Germans. Having to owe this much money, all the war reparations, it is unconscionable. No one has that much money. So, they did not predict what the Germans were going to do. So what we see is we see the Europeans get what they want in terms of vengeance and imperial claims. And we see ultimate frustration that, Woodrow Wilson had this chance to make such a good impact on the world stage and he comes up short. People are very weary of us, being involved in something like the League of Nations. And, our immigrants, we talked about this at the beginning of the chapter. Culturally, the Irish don't like the British. Culturally, the German immigrants associate with Germany. You also have the Italians are completely left out in the negotiation. They're very frustrated as well, and you get something like this cartoon in which you have the Western European countries having a strangle around the German the German throat, forcing the peace terms down. So they're they're putting the German government into heavy debt. And you know, in after the war is over and this peace treaty is created, so we're getting into 1920 now, and Woodrow Wilson is trying to do everything he can to save this treaty within the United States. He doesn't have the authority. The Senate has the authority. So Henry Cabot Lodge is the Republican leader on the Foreign Relations Committee. And Henry Cabot Lodge tears this whole thing apart, creates his own treaty that we would sign with Germany ending the war. And Woodrow Wilson vetoes it, says, no, don't vote for it. Wilson doesn't realize how toxic this whole League of Nations concept is. Here in the United States, we like to think that we're above international organizations. We don't, we don't like the UN telling us what needs to be done. We don't like the World Health Organization telling us what needs to be done. So we value our sovereignty, and this is a test to that. People view the League of Nations as a test to it. So it's one of the reasons why even Democrat senators kind of shy away from joining the League of Nations. And in 1920, Woodrow Wilson, even though he's not running for a presidential election, he is running on trying to preserve the League of Nations and win, the presidency for the Democrats and win the Senate for the Democrats and all. Well, it's not going to happen. All right, it is not going to happen. So when we look at the treaty here, all right, there's Henry Cabot Lodge leading the treaty out from the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, and you can see the lamb from the slaughter. The whole election in 1920 is a solemn referendum on the League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles. And it is rejected. It is rejected. And the Republicans run on American sovereignty and an end to the progressive movement. So they run Warren G. Harding from Urbana, Ohio, which is northeast of Dayton, just east of Springfield. And Warren G. Harding, we'll get into him when we talk about chapter 20, but he's going to be completely overwhelmed by the presidency. He wants a return to normalcy. He wants an end to progressive reform. He wants to scale back. He believes the government's becoming too involved. So what we see is that the U.S. abandons the Versailles Treaty. We sign a separate peace agreement with the Germans. And realistically, we leave Germany we hang Germany out to dry. And the Germans then create the final, are part of the reason they create the financial situation for the Great Depression. Because Britain and France did not predict that the Germans would just print all this money in order to pay off the war reparations. The new German government prints millions of dollars to pay off the war reparations, causing hyperinflation, which in turn is going to help lead us down a quick path to the Great Depression. Remember, things happen over time. All right, we go back first semester. Andrew Jackson wins re-election in 1832, dissolves the bank in 1833. When does that financial panic happen? 1837. So we're looking at war reparations being paid off in the 1920s, in the early to mid 1920s. the consequences of that and hyperinflation are going to really start to rear their ugly head in the late 1920s, right? So when we talk about how society looks so great and we talk about the roaring 20s and all of this, understand that behind it all is the lead up to the Great Depression, right? So thank you, gentlemen, for listening to this, and C and D Bell, you'll get something for tomorrow. E and G, I will see you on Monday. Thank you, guys.